Welcome, everybody, to the Cosmic Dispatch, a show about heavenly bodies, earth bodies, time, experience, and the relationship between all of it. I'm your host, Cory Nakasue, and it's March. It's spring. No, it's not quite yet, but it feels like it. I'm a little bit giddy and loopy today because I was able to take a walk today in shirt sleeves. And it's really exciting for me anyway. And it's my birthday month. So yeah, I'm all kinds of, anticipatory right now. This time of year is always exciting for me because I'm not a winter person. And I'm just so ready for spring. And I know I'm not alone here. This transition feels like the most dramatic one, like seasonally, because we're basically dealing with the transition between death, which is represented by Pisces, the season we're in, and birth, represented by Aries. And I was in Virginia a couple weeks ago, and I could already see some daffodil shoots popping out of the ground, and it's still cold. And we'll probably get another snow, but we can feel that disruption of energy and the burgeoning, life that's like right at that threshold of coming into being. And, the anticipation is like killing me. And at the same time, that moment of anticipation is also quite exciting and enlivening in itself. Kind of the way in which, when we're kids, that month-long lead up to Christmas is just as much of an event as, the day itself. But it is still Pisces season, and we haven't quite finished dissolving. And today, we're going to investigate the part of the Pisces experience that can transmute pain, ultimately redefining how we think about pain. Now, this could be the physical sensation of pain, emotional anguish, or other forms of mental suffering. These parts of the Pisces nature pull in the qualities of empathy, martyrdom, injury, longing, sacrifice, and sensitivity. But much like the mutable nature of Pisces, we're not dealing with these qualities discreetly, just in and of themselves. We're dealing with the uniquely Piscean process of using pain as a portal to states of ecstasy, transcendence, connection, healing, and ultimately divine love. And I use the word divine because in Pisces, we're not talking about the conditional love between mere mortals. In Pisces, we're talking about the unconditional devotion, often reserved for gods. A love so unconditional that we'd be willing to make all kinds of sacrifices for an entity we can't even see, an entity we can't even touch. This is where, we'd start to pull in the elements of faith, imagination, and divine compassion. Basically, if you hurt, I hurt, which brings us full circle back to empathy. A common astrological trope is that if Pisces doesn't serve, it suffers. And so if this is the case, I would think that part of the Pisces mandate would be to get real creative with pain, exalt it, get some kind of thrill out of it. And by so doing these things with it, redefine it. This all plays out somewhere in all of our lives, even if it's repressed, or maybe it's something you're drawn to. or attracted to in some way. Maybe, you can't help but want to bring home every stray and wounded animal or person you encounter, or maybe your punishing workout gives you the feeling of euphoria. This can play out in all kinds of ways. So some of the working titles I have for this episode are The Agony and the Ecstasy, of course, or The Ecstasy of the Agony, Hurts So Good, which might be a little too cute, I Feel Your Pain, and the one I'll probably end up going with is Pain as Portal. And when I think of this subject matter in terms of music, this song kept running through my head. I think of EMA. She's a singer-songwriter, and does a lot of stuff with electronica. She has this song called Marked, where she repeats over and over, I wish that every time he touched me left a mark. Now, barring an abusive read on that, I think it speaks to treasuring the evidence that something has transformed you. The same could be said of an injury. And, some people wear their injuries like badges of honor. People who do very extreme things with their body. I used to, dance very seriously, and I remember being with other dancers in rehearsal, and we'd be looking at all of our bruises and showing each other all of our scrapes and bragging about our injuries and our floor burns. And they were physical manifestations of some very intense emotional or experiential things that we were going through. But then to actually see the marks and the evidence of it was, it had this really interesting catharsis. And and there are some religions that even use self-injury as a way to get closer to God. And I would consider all of these things to be the domain of Pisces. In the second half of the show, I'll be speaking with Margherita Tisato, whose work with these states in the body-mind is expressed through art, movement teachings, and other interventions. And she also happens to have a natal chart that's very reflective of the current astrology as well. So we'll be talking with her about the transmutation and other creative aspects of pain and the pain experience in the second half of the show. And just a heads up that we may drift into some mature subject matter. So if you think this content might not be right for you, there's your warning. But before we go there, let's get into the astrology for the coming week. So the first major shift happened this morning. In the wee hours of this morning, Mars and Venus made their exact conjunction and entered Aquarius. And it really does look like the two things happen almost at the exact same time. Like Mars grabs Venus by the hand and they cross the threshold into this new territory together. And when they make this conjunction, Venus moves ahead of Mars. She's finally picking up speed after that retrograde and that long stay in Capricorn. This conjunction is important for a few reasons. Sorry, I'm a little dry. I had to have some water, in the spirit of Pisces. So this conjunction is important for a few reasons. The first one being, where am I? The first one being, it finally moves us out of Capricorn. And it finally moves us out of the Capricorn energy and into a more forward-thinking and emotionally detached and socially aware environment. We're really ready for something new and less inclined to feel that we need to respect boundaries, the past, or outmoded ways of being. We might feel more inclined to do our own thing without worrying about what others think, but we also might feel more inclined to be a part of a group or associate ourselves with people who all have a common ideology. So this could go a couple of different ways. This could also be read as wanting to figure out how to be social in new ways or new rules and ideas about our interactions with groups and communities. Mars and Venus are now in a sign that Saturn is occupying, which does indicate that there may be limits or curtailments to moving forward, which could result in acts of rebellion. But it's definitely a tonal shift from the last 4 months of Capricorn activity that we've been inundated with. It's sparkier, it's edgier, maybe even deviant. The second reason this is a big deal is because these two make their conjunction at 0 degrees Aquarius. This has been a hot degree over the past couple of years. So back in March 2020, Mars and Saturn had their conjunction there, which marked the introduction of pandemic social restrictions. So I don't know if you can think back a couple years to March 2020. And then in December of 2020, we had the Great Conjunction. And that was the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter at 0 degrees Aquarius, which marked the introduction of the vaccines. And now we have this Venus-Mars conjunction at 0 degrees Aquarius. And I have a feeling that this will mark a new chapter in the pandemic story from a social perspective. How are we social now? And this is what astrology does. It tells us about where the chapters of a story begin and end, and the types of elements contained in that story. And 0 degrees Aquarius is all about social norms, social deviation, and social integration. Next year in March 2023, Pluto finally moves into Aquarius and hits 0 degrees Aquarius. And there's a whole 3-hour show about that, about what Pluto does with the social order that I won't get into now. But if we keep looking at 0 degrees Aquarius, we can kind of see a story developing and a warm up to some of the radical things that Pluto conjunct 0 degrees Aquarius portends. Yeah, but that is really that's a whole other show. And let's see, the third thing that makes this conjunction so interesting is that it's the second time Venus and Mars have hooked up in 3 weeks, which is very rare. So this also describes and adds to the relational focus of these times. I'm thinking people are really ready to be with each other in new ways, whether this shows up as intimate or social. And I see a lot of conversation and conceptualizing, perhaps negotiating. Aquarius is the mental realm. So negotiating or arguing about space, needing more of it, needing less of it, how to organize it in, so that we can get along, so that we can relate. The next big shift we have this week is Mercury moving into Pisces. As with everything, this placement is really good for some things, not so much for others. Mercury tends to do better in signs that can discern and differentiate, like its home signs, Virgo and Gemini. Mercury can get a little lost in Pisces, especially with Jupiter and Neptune present. So, Mercury represents cognition and communication, among other things. So in Pisces, the mind becomes very attuned to emotion, imagination. The mind is also very impressionable in Pisces, maybe even a little gullible. Communications can be very fluid and very beautiful, but not very precise. I would watch for beautiful lies over the next 3 weeks. This could be the temptation to lie so that you don't have to deal with the reality of a situation, or to create a more fantastic atmosphere. There's also a higher chance of missing red flags because we really want to see the ideal. This is a great Mercury for creative writing, painting, music, dance, either doing these things or going to experience these things, doing some dream work, mental clearing. Because we may be really forgetful, during this time in an absent-minded kind of way. This Mercury is not so great for doing your taxes or any kind of communication that needs to be clear and succinct. The mind is really slippery right now. Think of the word confusion. So you have the first part of that word, con, C-O-N, which means like with, and then fusion, with fusion. And then fusion is, it's all together. Again, not differentiated. So this means no separation. And we can't tell one thing from the other. Things can come in and out almost too easily, which could open the doors of perception wide open, but also could be problematic in situations where you really need to hit a mark or clearly understand something. So bring on the poetry and leave the number crunching for another time, and beware of smooth talk, double talk. If it looks too good to be true, sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Or it might be all that. I'm cynical. So, just give it a moment before you act. Maybe do some due diligence. That's one way to handle a Mercury in Pisces. Or just go with it. I feel like in our culture, we value and put so much emphasis on practical evidence, and we devalue all the other ways we can feel things, understand things, know things, without this hard evidence. But both are useful and both are valid. You just need to know what world you're in. For instance, like if you are doing your taxes, you're not going to go into that work with your intuition. And if you're, trying to relate to someone intimately, or do some bit of creative art, you're not going to try to itemize everything. So they're cross purposes. So just really important to know what world you're in, what you're doing, and orient your mind, appropriately. That's all. And joining me today is Margherita Tisato. Margherita is a dancer, teacher to teachers, movement enthusiast, and a passionate change maker. She has been dancing and teaching since she was 17 and leading yoga classes, workshops, and teacher trainings for over a decade. Margherita is known for creating trauma-informed spaces for transformation. She facilitates a range of movement experiences spanning from yoga and somatic movement to dance, Butoh, and body suspension. Other educational offerings include experiential workshops in anatomy, pain science, embodiment, and trauma theory. She recently developed a system she calls direct embodied experience, a trauma-informed practice of body-based awareness rooted in communication, inquiry, and the belief in transformation, aimed at supporting educators through professional development workshops and individuals through one-on-one mentorship. Notably, she has taught in prisons and addiction recovery programs in New York City since 2015 and has been a guest speaker at the University of Nebraska and the TransArt Institute Creative Research PhD program with the Liverpool John Moores University. She's currently working on a research grant on embodiment and addiction through the University of Nebraska Rural Drug Addiction Research Center. Poetry, storytelling, neuroscience, and music inform her work as a teacher and performer. Hello.
Hello.
So good to have you here. So just so people know, I've known Margherita for several years, and our experience together has, encompassed a lot of different things, but always body-based, like always. And so I feel like I've been having, conversations with you about like all things body for a long time. So, but this is like really specific. I don't know if were you listening to the beginning of the show?
I was.
About the way that Pisces, encounters the pain experience and like the whole culture around this. I don't even know what to call, it's more than a sensation, depending on how you're talking about pain. And I have to just add another disclaimer before we get into it, but it also reminds me that our station manager, because I just run things by him, and I ran things by him for a show that we did with a sex coach, and he's like, you just want to add a disclaimer, but one of the things you could talk about is, why do we have to have a disclaimer, when we talk about certain body states that's, really, that might put people on edge or be offensive maybe. And so I'm wondering, with all the work, the intense, intimate, deep work you do with the body, if you find that you're in a sort of kind of niche or small enclave of people that has this practice, and then when you take it out into more say mainstream environments, if what kinds of reactions do people have?
So thank you for having me, Cory.
Yeah.
It's very nice to be here. I think that what I've come to, there is one really simple answer to that, is that it's just, I'm not a part of a small niche. Like,
Okay.
all dancers live and deal with pain all the time. All athletes do that. All people do that. In particular, perhaps people that are attracted to certain kinds of activities, they're more on the sensation seeking end of the spectrum, people that need more variety, more high intensity. But like anybody who is an athlete or a dancer to any level or at any level, they will be dealing with pain pretty much on a daily basis. We just don't talk about it, right? So there just happens to be, and this here we're talking about physical pain, right? And physical and emotional pain and spiritual pain tend to overlap in a lot of ways that are also fascinating. But I think that what puts me into a little bit more of a niche is the fact that there are some particular methodologies or techniques that have started to acknowledge that, right? So you moved even from a dance perspective, and have been a dancer my whole life pretty much, right? From a dance perspective, you moved also from ballet, where everything had to look a certain way and be light and be, joyful and happy or poetic or lyric, into modern dance first, where we started to acknowledge weight and gravity and rebound at kind of like the material existence of the human body, and then into more contemporary forms, of which in particular Buto is my thing, where we started to acknowledge that there is pain in the body and there is pain in the human experience, which is something that we have acknowledged on a philosophical level, especially in the East, if you think about Zen traditions and all of those, for a very long time. But then we don't necessarily like to look into it. And we have sanitized pain and death and disease from our direct experience, especially in privilege. I'm talking as a white, middle-class, privileged person that lives in the United States, So this is obviously not true anywhere or everywhere in the world, but it is true for people like me that tend to also have a large influence in terms of what we see in the widespread cultural panorama, right? Like my voices of people like me are heard a little bit more than others. I mean, I'm still a woman, but still. So I don't think I'm in a niche necessarily. I think that what makes it different is that we purposefully look into it and integrate the experience of pain into our creative and artistic process, and to some degree, for some people, in a therapeutic or healing process. And that's some of what they do in therapy all the time. It's like re-exposure to certain events through talking or through, doing or experiencing things, so that our tolerance increases, right? So I think that there is this really interesting disconnect that I see all the time, where like we acknowledge suffering and we acknowledge pain as a universal experience, and we work on it, and yet when we talk about physical pain, then it kind of, the only thing that we want to do is avoid it and not talk about it, and it comes through as a weakness, right? And that creates a host of issues, including addiction and lack of care and further injuries and trauma and all kinds of things. This is a little bit of a broad way of answering your question, but
No, that's
what happens.
No, that's really helpful. It's really informative. So you mentioned dance, which is something you do, and Buto. You do a couple other practices. You do shibari and suspension work. Could you tell our audience a bit about those practices?
I can. Shibari or kinbaku is a Japanese practice of rope bondage. So in some ways you can think aerial arts, but instead of being done with like fabrics or silks or trapeze, it's done with rope. And the body is, instead of interacting directly and actively with the apparatus that is holding it up in the air, is actually bound and restrained, usually by another person, and shaped and put into certain positions and put up in the air or not. So you kind of add to the to the element of being up in the air, a sense of the body being shaped. There's usually like a dynamic, a power dynamic or a power exchange between the two people. And, you know, none of these things is particularly comfortable. Like, I don't think people do trapeze because it feels good necessarily, or other things like that. But like, definitely being bound with rope on, you know, naked skin is not the most pleasant sensation that you could possibly think of. It's not, so there's also definitely an element of discomfort there. Can be more or less painful depending on what you do. And hook suspension is a practice that has existed for a very, very long time in a lot of tribal traditions all over the place in the United States and in the East and in India and the Philippines. And there are places where some of the rituals are still active, particularly in India and in the Philippines, that I know of, where they do parades and they pierce their bodies, and you'll see people walking around in the parades with, like, you know, long metal spikes coming out of their bodies and such stuff. And at some point in the 70s, 80s, it started to kind of seep into the alternative body modification circles in the United States and all over the world, in Europe too. And some people started to create performances and practices around this. We usually trace it back to, I guess the big names are Fakir Musafar, who was one of the creators of the modern primitive movement, who used to do this, and he really leaned into the tribal experiences, and he passed away, I think, 2 years ago. And then another person that was very influential and that took a little bit of a different approach, because he's a performance artist, is Stellark, who used to started off with body suspensions and doing mostly performances and things like that. So what happens in body suspensions with hooks is that you literally take needles and you pierce through the skin of the person on a superficial level. So there's no muscles, no, you know, deep tissue injuries or anything like that. And then you connect them to a hook, connect them to rope, and then pick them up in the air hanging. The way, not the most pleasant of images, but kind of like, you know, when you see meat hanging at the butcher.
Okay.
Really, you know, it's pretty much like that. Yeah, so I do those things as well, and I do both. I practice on both ends of on the spectrum. Like, I facilitate for other people, and I am tied and suspended also. So
Yeah, I can see that as being something really important for people to see if they don't want to participate, to like be confronted with another person undergoing a deeply intense bodily / emotional / spiritual experience, and for that, just to like witness it being a somatic practice, or maybe even like a somatic conditioning, as well as doing it. So you're working with these forms in a creative and artistic way. Is there a like somatic practice or healing practice that you or that people like facilitate specifically with these two practices?
there's no specific, really, and sadly, actually, I'm just going to go ahead and say it, and then I'll take the backlash from all of the communities. But I think that there's actually not a lot of awareness of somatic practices, and because both of these things come from very specific cultural environments, the body, like in the case of hook suspensions, if you look at like traditional and rituals and tribal things, like the idea was to transcend the mortal realm and to move on and transcend pain and do all of that, right? So there's really no big reason why one should be too concerned with involving somatic experiences in that particular practice. And shibari comes from, a number of different subcultures and alternative cultures in Japan were also, what it used to be, or the way that it started was a lot more focused on the power dynamic and the power exchange between the two people than it was about what things looked like or what things even felt like for particularly the people that were getting tied, right? They were receiving rope. So people that were receiving rope, they were meant to and supposed to be in pain, period, right? So there wasn't a lot of attention. And that's one of the way that actually shibari has evolved, is by creating a lot more awareness and attention on what the risks can be, because these are very dangerous activities. Definitely, both of them. Shibari possibly even more so than hook suspensions in some ways. And damage can easily be done, right? And so part of what happened is actually we are starting now, possibly over the past 5, 6, maybe 10 years, maybe less than that, to see people really considering how can we make these practices more accessible, how can we make these practices less risky, given that there is, again, a pretty high stake in terms of damage potential. But there is no specific practice, which is actually one of the things that I've started to do, is teach workshops in somatics and the basic somatics for people that specifically are interested in these practices, because what makes the experience valuable, I shouldn't say valuable because that's a judgment, what makes the experience more less dangerous or decreases the risk of traumatization is actually the level of agency that people have, right? Part of like our pain tolerance, and there is studies in this, our pain tolerance changes vastly if we have agency over the pain that we're experiencing or if we don't, if it's expected or not, right? So in these kind of situations, there's specific negotiation, you know what's going to happen, you can come out of it whenever you need to or want to, unless accidents happen, again. But like the general guidelines that like the person in hooks or the person in rope has complete agency over what is happening, right? And so in order for that to be true, we need to make sure that the person that is experiencing the rope or the hooks is not just disassociating. And that's one thing that can very commonly happen with intense bodily state, and in particular with pain. So part of what I'm trying to do, and I'm not alone, there are at least a couple of other people that I know of, is to educate people to pay more attention to their bodies, or to be able to better negotiate the intensity or the subtlety of sensations, so that we can stay present during the entirety of the experience. And this is actually something that I've learned from working in addiction and working with people that have trauma in the end. I'm just kind of exporting it into this other specific environment, but the ability to be present and to have agency and to build agency, however you want it to look like in terms of practice, it doesn't really matter to me. Like I have a series of somatic practices that I do, but it could look a number of ways. For some people, it's like ultra marathons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I don't do
totally. Over the past couple of years, I feel like the trauma, just the word trauma, has that could have been like the word of like what 2019 all the way to now. Everyone's traumatized, and this is causing trauma, and there's trauma informed cooking classes. There's like trauma, like and everyone. And I feel like we're really inundated with this word, but I also feel like in sometimes I get so confused about like what's like mainstream and what's in my bubble. Like in my bubble, it's like, oh, trauma this, trauma that, and everybody's doing trauma. And then I hear a lot of people who I'm not sure what their experience is with it, and they're throwing down that word like all the time. And I would like to hear from you, because I think you'd probably explain this just so super well. What differentiates trauma from a painful experience or a hurtful, uncomfortable experience?
That's a great question. And I'm just gonna start this also as a side note. I am starting to get a little. I'm really appreciative of the fact that trauma is entering the mainstream, and the idea of trauma is entering the mainstream. And I started doing this work 10 years ago, and it was really, really hard to talk about this. I'm glad that it's not the case anymore. However, I think that there is a major issue with saying that everybody has trauma and everybody's traumatized, and with labeling certain things as traumatizing. Because this tends to devalue, in a way, the experience of the people that are actually experiencing trauma. And I'm not using PTSD, which is a technical diagnosis, because it's not inclusive of a lot of trauma experiences. But, I think that over-pathologizing or over-diagnosing is also problematic, especially when it comes from people that have no place diagnosing anybody because they're not doctors. All of that said, the main thing that we need to remember is that it's never the experience itself that is traumatizing, right? It is the way that our body reacts and processes or fails to process the experience that is the trauma aspect, right? So you have two people that can go through the exact same experience, right? Namely a pandemic or a assault or an accident or a disaster or loss of a loved one, or you name it, right? And one person will experience pain and suffering and grief and will heal, right, and process. And the other person will develop certain symptoms that are typical of the people that have trauma or complex trauma that will affect them and their lives, and they will have a harder time processing what is happening. So challenging situations are not themselves traumatizing. They are unpleasant. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are unpleasant and difficult, and that doesn't make them inherently traumatizing. The thing that makes it a little bit more confusing is that we don't know yet why some people have one experience and come out fine and some people don't. We know that there are certain indicators and certain markers that will facilitate one way or the other. Childhood adverse experiences are one of them. Like if you're as a child you've had abusive parents or neglect, or were raised in poverty or during a war, or certain situations like this can definitely increase the possibility for trauma to develop in people's life later on or right away. People that have more easeful, supported, loved, connected childhood tend to have a little bit more resilience, right? However, we also know that resilience comes from challenges. So people that don't have any challenges might also have a much lower tolerance to discomfort, right? And so experiences that might not be or they might not seem as intense or as problematic, they might actually create a state of trauma, because that is something that is so far beyond their threshold of tolerance that they can't process it, right? So it's very, very individual and very, very context related, which is what kind of makes it more complicated. We also know that some of the trauma that we carry, or some of the signifiers of trauma that we carry, might not be part of our direct life experience, but they might come from previous generations even. And we see this in survivors of, or children and descendants of Holocaust survivors or war survivors or such and such things, right? So there is stuff that we carry and genes that we carry that become activated not because of things that directly happen to us, but because of things that are carried in our ancestors' DNA, which is also what we saw during the pandemic with the disproportionate amount of Black people and people of color that were affected, and the higher rates of mortality during the pandemic, during pregnancies and deliveries and so on and so forth. And that is in part because the healthcare system is not geared towards taking good care of minorities, which are not even minorities anymore, or almost. And in part, though, because there's a history of trauma that is carried in the bodies, and the bodies become more more prone to develop certain symptoms or certain diseases. Because that's one of the things that can happen with trauma, is that the immune system doesn't have as much of an ability to take good care of the body because it's worried doing something else, which is try to resolve that event that wasn't able to process when it happened. And maybe it doesn't even know what event it is. So it's a really, really large loop, really, that can be brought into the body, because all of it manifests at the level of the body, no matter what.
Right.
It kind of starts and ends with the body.
Right. Now, that was a complete answer. Thank you so much for that. Like, that was like probably one of the best fully realized definitions of trauma that I've heard. And I really like the, focusing on the context, and it's the intersection of the event with a particular nervous system, a particular nervous system pattern and history that creates this thing called trauma, and not, the thing that happened to you, which is like, that's an isolated. I think that is so key for everyone to get clear on, because words matter. And when and this is true for, like, I think all these terms, there's so many terms right now that are just kind of like, like shorthand people are using for this and that. And we got our, like Instagram influencers, like just kind of spewing a lot of shorthand. When we have these like these words that are these like signifiers of things, that's what makes these ideas and concepts really easy to be co-opted by something else. And so if we're not like communicating and really careful about, what we're calling things, then it's just easy for, some other entity to just co-opt that word and then start, pumping that word out there and trying to, commodify it, make something off of it. And so I really appreciate that explanation. And so you are developing a system, and it's called direct embodied experience. Would it involve like I'm wondering if like one of the things you do, like when you're working with people, is one of the key things that you're doing, facilitating people to get to this point of resolve, like so that they go through, that the resolve process like culminates somehow?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question I still have. I don't really have an answer, and I think that there are, in literature there are different opinions. I'm not entirely sure that trauma is ever resolved, that we ever get through it. I think that symptoms can get better and things can become more manageable, and also I think that in the end, what I've come to appreciate more is integrating rather than resolving, because I think it's important to remember that becomes part of who we are, no matter what, and there is no value judgment, right? It could be, it could be traumatized and develop PTSD because you had to do something that was against your ethical values, or because something terrible was done to you, right? So there's no moral judgment there either. And there's no hierarchy to trauma, right? But integrating is an idea that I have come to like and appreciate a little bit more. And I think that part of the work that I'm developing, it's kind of built around the possibility to acknowledge what might be going on, and then move. I'm not even going to say move through it, because I don't know what we're moving through, but in bringing the body into movement or direct experience of touch, movement, sensations, whatever, so that we can then come back. Because the movement and certain kinds of movement or embodied experience in particular can help us, and somatic practices in particular can help us to soften the emotional affect, so that we can then be a little bit more clear-headed when we go back and look into the issue again, so that there is this sort of, so that the movement becomes a coping mechanism, whatever, am I calling it movement kind of loosely because it's movement or practices or experiences, but it becomes a coping mechanism and also a tool to be able to come back to revisit the situations when they need to come back. And that's kind of what I'm working with, and widening the window of tolerance for different types of sensations and different types of stimuli with people that might have a difficulty experiencing either intense sensation or very subtle sensations, because they can create triggers or unpleasant states in the body. And integrating what we are and what we're carrying. Disinterrupting, which is not a word. I think I just made that up. But disinterrupting the conversation or the thread of who we are ancestrally and in our own individual experience.
Wow. I think, and I'm biased. I really do think that this is the work. Like, this is like the most important. This is kind of the foundational work when we, talk about, learning how to be in community with each other, and how to more to productively just live as a society and not destroy each other. Like, this is the foundational this is it, because we are first and foremost a body in response to everything. Almost out of time here, but I heard there is a rumor that you're coming to Kingston to do a workshop. And if so, like, when would that be? And really quickly, like, what would that be?
I'm going to be really, really fast. It should be the first weekend of May, which I forgot the date, but I think it's the 6th and 7th or something along those lines. And I should be in Kingston with my rope partner, doing a beginner's workshop in shibari kimbaku and a performance. So yeah, I'm hoping to be in your neck of the woods very soon, actually.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Margherita, for joining us today. And all of Margherita's information will be up on the archives, as is every episode of the Cosmic Dispatch on radiokingston.org. I will see you next week. Take care. The Cosmic Dispatch is a weekly show that uses astrology as a catalyst for conversations with people from all walks of life, an exercise in making astrology an accessible part of your week. You can find out more about my work at www.astrologybycory.com.